She didn't attend her brother's funeral. But her silence said everything. It was a quiet morning in Itasca, Indiana. The kind of small-town morning where birdsong blends with the sound of a neighbor's porch swing and the rustling of old maple trees in the breeze. Evelyn Moore sat by her window, a steaming cup of tea resting in her hands, untouched. On the kitchen table lay a folded copy of the New York Times, its headline bold and final. Pope Thomas I dies at 84, the world mourns a humble shepherd. The world was in mourning, indeed. Rome had become a sea of candles and crowds. Leaders from across continents were preparing to attend the funeral of a man hailed as the People's Pope, the first American ever to sit on the chair of St. Peter. But here in Indiana, in a modest one-story house with peeling white shutters, his only surviving sibling, the woman who had once wiped his scraped knees and whispered prayers to help him sleep, chose to remain in silence. Evelyn, now 76, was a woman of few words. Her neighbors knew her as the kindly widow who sent banana bread to church fundraisers, who knelt every morning before sunrise to pray the rosary, and who wore her late husband's flannel shirts around the house because they still smelled like him. But very few knew she was the older sister of the Pope. She never spoke of it. Never mentioned the Vatican calls or the handwritten letters that arrived every Christmas. Not even when the local newspaper tried to interview her after the papal election. Let him do his work, she had said with a polite smile. That's between him and God. When Pope Thomas I, born Thomas More, died suddenly of a stroke following a long battle with pneumonia, the Catholic world reacted with shock. He had just delivered an Easter homily filled with warmth and clarity. Now, he was gone. The Vatican announced a public viewing at St. Peter's Basilica, followed by a historic funeral expected to be attended by millions. But Evelyn didn't book a flight. Didn't pack a bag. Didn't even turn on the television. Instead, she sat at her window. Watching the dogwood trees sway, remembering a barefoot boy with dirt on his cheeks and holy fire in his eyes. Remembering Thomas not as the Pope but as her little brother, Tommy. The silence from Evelyn sent ripples across the press. CNN ran a segment asking, why did the Pope's sister skip his funeral? Rumors swirled. Was she protesting something? Angry at the church? Was there a family rift? She didn't answer any of them. She didn't need to. Because sometimes, the loudest truths are whispered, not shouted. Sometimes, the truest love doesn't wear black or stand in line at grand cathedrals. It simply sits by the window, with tea gone cold, and a heart full of memory. She wasn't in Rome. But everyone was talking about her. 2 days after Pope Thomas I passed away, the world's cameras turned not just toward Vatican City but toward Indiana. The silence had become too loud. On every major news outlet, in every faith column and social media post, a single question echoed. Why isn't the Pope's sister at his funeral? CNN aired live coverage from St. Peter's Square, and somewhere in the lower third of the screen, a headline scrolled across. Evelyn Moore remains in U.S., no statement issued. Talk show panels speculated everything from family disputes to theological protest. A religious blog even suggested she had grown disillusioned with her brother's progressive reforms. She watched none of it. The doorbell rang more in one day than it had in 5 years combined. Neighbors dropped off flowers, casseroles, and awkward words. Reporters knocked, then waited in parked vans down the street with long lenses and expectations. Her priest even called to offer pastoral support, though the tremble in his voice suggested he was really asking, why, Evelyn? Why aren't you there? But Evelyn said nothing. Not because she didn't care. Not because she was broken or bitter. But because grief had its own rules. And so did love. That morning, she sat in her living room holding a worn envelope. It was one of many, each with the same handwriting, the same careful script she'd known since childhood. Inside was a letter dated Christmas 2023. Dear Ev. I've been thinking lately how strange it is that we live our lives for the world, but the ones who know us best aren't the ones reading the headlines. Rome is cold this year, but I still keep the window open a bit at night. It reminds me of home. I miss your apple pie. I miss Dad's old Bible. I miss being just Tommy. Love. T. She read it again. The world wanted a scene. A statement. A quote. A photo. But Evelyn knew Tommy wouldn't have wanted that. She could almost hear his voice, teasing gently, "Don't you dare let them put you on TV, Ev." No. Her place wasn't in St. Peter's Basilica with cameras flashing. Her goodbye wouldn't be televised. It would happen right here, in this room, with that letter and that memory and that quiet ache that words couldn't touch. And yet, the world outside kept asking. Demanding. Judging. The louder the noise became, the more determined she was to keep silent. Not out of spite, but out of faith. Not out of rebellion, but out of reverence. For her brother. For herself. For the sacred space between the two. Before he was Pope Thomas, he was just Tommy. The memories came like waves, not rushed or violent, but steady. Gentle. Familiar. Evelyn sat at her kitchen table, a shoebox in front of her. Inside were dozens of letters. Some tied with twine, others still in their envelopes, postmarked from places like Brazil, South Africa, Rome. They had one thing in common, they all began with "Dear Ev." She pulled out the oldest one, dated July 1972. It was written in blue ink, slanted to the right, with the occasional smudge from someone who still wrote like a boy. "I made it to seminary. Can you believe that? I have my own bunk. My roommate snores. I miss your Sunday pancakes. Pray for me, okay?" She smiled. Tommy had always been the quiet one. The one who asked big questions at the dinner table. The one who stayed behind to help Mom with the dishes. The one who, at 9 years old, told Evelyn he wanted to work for God someday. Their father had chuckled. Their mother had wept. And Evelyn had just nodded. Because somehow, she believed him. Growing up in a small town with nothing but a strong church and a struggling school system, the Moore kids didn't have much, but they had faith. And each other. Evelyn had been 11 when Tommy was born. Too old to play tag with him, but just young enough to still hold his hand when he cried. She was the one who walked him to Sunday school, who patched his elbows when he fell off his bike, who taught him how to kneel properly during Mass. They shared a room during thunderstorms, Tommy in a blanket fort under her bed, Evelyn whispering Psalm 23 to calm him down. He used to call her Sister Ev. Not out of piety, just love. When he became a priest, then a bishop, then a cardinal, she was always there, just out of frame. Never at the press conferences. Never at the ceremonies. But always in the pews. Always in the background. "Promise me one thing, Tommy," she once said, right before he left for Rome as a young cardinal. "Don't let them take your soul." He had smiled, reached for her hand, and whispered, "You're the one who gave it shape, Ev. I'm taking you with me." And when the white smoke rose from the Sistine Chapel, and the world learned that Cardinal Thomas More had become Pope Thomas I, Evelyn didn't cheer. She just closed her eyes, whispered a prayer, and baked his favorite pie. The phone didn't stop ringing for a week. But she didn't answer a single call. Now, in her kitchen, she opened another letter. "They gave me a palace. I chose a 2-room apartment instead. The window here faces the sunrise. It reminds me of the farm. I still hear Dad's whistle in the breeze sometimes. Funny, huh?" She wiped a tear before it could fall. He had never stopped being Tommy. Even when he wore white robes and stood on balconies waving to millions, he still signed his letters. "Love you always, T." That's why she didn't go to Rome. Because the boy she loved, the brother she raised, the man of God she believed in wasn't buried in marble or encased in gold. He was here. In letters. In prayer. In the silence they had always shared. I already said goodbye. Just not in front of cameras. It was a Tuesday morning. Quiet. Cloudy. The kind of morning that made you want to stay wrapped in an old sweater and drink tea until noon. Evelyn rose before sunrise, like she always did. She said her morning prayers, watered the geraniums on her porch, and opened the mailbox not expecting much, maybe a bill, a church bulletin, or another envelope from someone offering condolences she didn't ask for. But this time, there was something else. A letter from the Itasca Daily Gazette, her tiny town's only newspaper. Inside was a short, polite note from the editor. Ms. Moore, we've received over 70 emails asking why you haven't spoken. If you ever wish to share something, even just a few lines, we'd be honored to publish it. She sat with that letter all day. Then that evening, Evelyn did something she hadn't done in years. She pulled out her old typewriter. The keys were a little stiff, the ribbon faint, but it still worked. Her fingers hovered, paused, then began. She didn't write for the world. She wrote for Tommy. And for the people who knew what love looked like: quiet, loyal, and unspectacular. The next morning, her letter appeared on page 3 of the Gazette. A black and white headline read, "A Sister's Goodbye." And underneath, just 327 words. I didn't attend the funeral in Rome. I understand why that may have seemed strange. But you see, I already said goodbye. Not in a cathedral filled with music and gold. But in a small living room, holding his last letter, whispering a prayer over a cup of tea. My brother was a great man to the world. But to me, he was just Tommy, the boy who asked too many questions in Sunday school, who shared his bread with hungry classmates, who fixed mom's broken crucifix with tape and faith. He told me once, "Ev, when I go, don't stand in front of the cameras. Just tell God thank you for the time we had." So that's what I did. The letter caught fire. First in town. Then online. Then across the country. National news outlets picked it up. Faith blogs reprinted it. Priests read it aloud from pulpits. Even the Vatican issued a brief statement calling it a profoundly touching reflection of familial love. But Evelyn didn't care about any of that. She didn't turn on the TV. She didn't do interviews. She didn't return calls. Instead, she made her brother's favorite pie, set it on the table beside a candle, and whispered, "We're even now, Tommy. I kept my promise. I stayed out of the spotlight." She never stood at the altar. But somehow, she gave the eulogy. For a week after the letter was published, Evelyn's mailbox overflowed. Letters came from everywhere: New York, Texas, even Italy. Not from journalists, but from strangers. A widow in Boston who had lost her brother to cancer. A retired priest in Arizona who said her words reminded him of his sister, who died young. A nun in Kentucky who wrote, "You showed us the quiet holiness of family." There were no interviews. No press conferences. Evelyn didn't crave attention. She simply stacked the letters, tied them with ribbon, and kept them in the same shoebox where she kept Tommy's. At church the following Sunday, people gave her space. Not out of avoidance, but reverence. The choir director paused mid-service and said softly, "Before we begin, let us take a moment for Evelyn Moore, for the letter that reminded us what true farewell looks like." And in that moment of stillness, Evelyn bowed her head, not because she wanted the recognition, but because she wanted to honor the one she and Tommy had always prayed to. At the Vatican, Pope Thomas's successor, a humble cardinal from the Philippines, quoted Evelyn during his first public address. "To the woman who said goodbye without cameras, may your example guide us back to the sacredness of simplicity." Her photo appeared beside that quote on the cover of L'Osservatore Romano. But she didn't keep the paper. She simply clipped the article, folded it, and tucked it inside one of Tommy's last letters. "He'd laugh if he saw this," she whispered, half amused, half tearful. "He'd say, 'Ev, I told you not to get famous.'" As the spring light filtered through her lace curtains, Evelyn returned to her daily rhythm. Morning rosary. Watering the flowers. Baking for neighbors. But something had changed, not in her, but in the way the world now saw her. She had reminded people of something they had forgotten. That grief doesn't have to be grand. That goodbyes don't need stages. That love, real love, can be quiet and still echo across the world. She didn't need a cathedral. She had a kitchen table, a candle, and a name she never stopped whispering. One evening in early May, Evelyn sat alone in her kitchen. The sun was setting slow and golden behind the maple trees. The smell of cinnamon and baked apples filled the room. On the table were 2 teacups, one for her, and one placed gently across from her, as it always had been during the holidays. Beside the second cup sat a folded piece of paper. Tommy's last letter. She didn't read it anymore, not because it hurt, but because she knew every word by heart. Keep praying. Keep loving. That's how you serve God when the world isn't watching. She lit a candle. Not for the world. Not for the Pope. But for her brother. For the boy who once stayed up late asking if angels really had wings. For the man who had carried his faith into palaces, prisons, and war zones without ever losing the softness of home. Outside, a soft breeze stirred the curtains. Evelyn looked out the window, where the last light kissed the earth. And with a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I'll see you again, Tommy." She didn't cry. She didn't need to. Because the kind of love they shared, the kind born in kitchens and whispered over prayers, doesn't die. It lives in letters. In silence. In memory. And in faith. The next day, she mailed a letter. Not to the Vatican. Not to the press. Just to a young girl she knew from church, who had recently lost her grandfather. Inside was a simple note. "Sweetheart, sometimes the best goodbyes happen in silence. Don't be afraid to love someone quietly. It still matters. Miss Evelyn." And that's how the sister of a pope ended her story. Not with cameras. Not with titles. But with a warm pie, a prayer, and a whisper heard only by heaven. True love needs no show. Deep faith does not require great ceremony. And perhaps the most touching goodbye is when you just sit quietly, by candlelight and memory, with love still in your heart.